Hey guys, welcome to this first part of our advanced tutorial for an inventory system made in Godot 3.1. In this first episode, we're going to be creating the user interface to which we will add functionality in the upcoming episodes. Before we start, let's have a look at the end result. As you can see here, we have a basic inventory system with a background. We have different tabs to open our different inventory categories. We can select weapons, which will show up in an item inspector. We can compare different items by clicking the compare button, in which case we can see two items at the same time to determine which one will be better for our build. And of course, once we have an item here, we can click the delete button to delete the item from our inventory. To finish it all off, we have a goal icon and counter to see how rich we are. As for the project setup, I've got a folder with the art here. We'll be using a double-edged background and a paper background. We also have a wood panel background and icons for both gold, a close button and a trash bin. As for the project settings in Godot, it's important that under project settings, display window, I've set the width and height to 1280 to 720. That's not required. You can enter your own width and height, but keep in mind that the pixel count I'm using to determine the size of different windows and different elements of the window will be based on this width and height. Also, it's important that you set mode in 2D and aspect to get the same functionality when it comes to responsiveness on mobile devices that I'm getting in this example. Now let's draw this puppy out. To start, we're going to create a new scene, a user interface, and I've accustomed myself to renaming everything immediately to make sure I keep an overview. So I'm creating a new node. This is going to be a container node in which we put everything else, and to that node I'm going to add a texture rectangle, which will be my double-edged background, with expand on so that the window, the element size, doesn't automatically resize based on the art's picture size. I'm going to add the double edged, and under layout I'm going to put it to full rectangle. Now I prefer my UI menus to show a little bit of game running in the background, so I think it helps with the orientation of the player. So on the margin, I'm going to add a little bit of margin. In my case, I'm going to add 30 pixels. Now I think this double edge is taking too much space of the inventory system and it doesn't look that great like this. So I'm going to add the next background, which will be another texture rectangle. And I'm going to overlap it a little bit. Now again, with expand on, I'm going to add my paper background, which I'll set to full rectangle. This time it will be a full rectangle to the parent, which is the already margined double-edged background. Now I've been fiddling around a little bit with my margins, and it should be around this for me to get a sort of depth within my inventory panel. With our background created, we're going to quickly rename this element so we keep an idea of where we are, and then we need to add our elements. When you add elements to Godot, it's important to think whether they're vertically or horizontally aligned with each other. So in our case, if we look at the example, we have a header which consists of a menu title and a closing button. We have all our main elements, and underneath we have a little bit of margin from the menu edge. Those are vertically aligned, and if we look at all the main elements, we can see a horizontal alignment of a pair of buttons, an icon and a counter, our inventory slots, and all the way to the right our item inspectors and delete and compare button. We need to recreate this by using VBox and HBox containers. It's important that you think about this, because when using VBox and HBox containers correctly, you can create a very powerful user interface which will also be immediately responsive to any screen size. To start, we're going to add a VBox container which will have all our main elements. Now within our VBox container we'll add two HBox containers, and I'm going to use D for duplicate. All the way on the bottom we're going to add a label. I'm used for margins, to create margins within a user interface. I usually just add a label with a set size. That way I find it much more easy to have the menu respond responsively and not reset itself to exclude the margin. So for our margin, this is going to be a margin underneath. So I'm going to set the minimum size to 20, and that will be our margin from now on. As we said before, the first box is for the header, and the second box, the second container, is going to be for our main elements. With these elements set up, let's make sure that our VBox container expands as much as possible. This will be important later on. So on the layout, we'll also put this one to set full rectangle to its parent. Now let's start making the header. Under the header, I'm going to add a label, which will be our menu title. And I'm going to add a texture button, which will be our exit button. Now under menu title, I don't want to use the standard font within Godot, because the possibilities and the variables within the standard font are very limited. So I want to add a custom font. For that, I'll add a new dynamic font under the custom font property. I'll click it once, and under the sub menu that pops up, I'll click font and say load, and I have downloaded a font, Xolonium, which I'll be using for this tutorial. Now with this loaded, I can set the settings. I can set the size to 32, and I prefer my fonts to have a darkish gray color to make it easy to read. With those settings set, I'll add inventory, and I'll add one space for a little bit of margin on the left hand side. Now we'll add our exit button. I want my exit button to be a size of 50 by 50 pixels, and I'll use expand on to make sure that when I add a picture, that doesn't resize by itself. Under textures, I'll add the normal texture, add the red cross to the normal texture. Now as you can see, the red cross doesn't automatically position itself in the right hand corner of the menu where we want it to be. Don't start trying to move the button within the properties of the button itself. Instead, when you want to create a responsive menu within Godot, you have to use other elements within the H box and the V boxes to push elements where you want them to go. So in our case, we're gonna set inventory to take as much space horizontally as it can by setting it to expand. By doing so, the label will take as much space as it can, thereby pushing the exit button all the way to the end. If I select my viewport, which is the 1280 by 720 we set in the settings, and I would resize it as if I have a different screen size, you can see that my menu is now responsive horizontally. We have to set the same sort of setting with our margin. As you can see now, our margin is located just on the inventory, and our main element is a very small 1 pixel high line on the whole horizontal side of the screen. We want to set this main element to take as much space as it can. We'll put that vertical, and we put it to expand. Now you can see it has expanded all the way down here, and down there is the margin which is left, and which will create our margins on the bottom of the screen. Within main elements, we of course also want margins on the left and the right hand side, so let's add those as well. We add two labels. We can duplicate these, and on the rectangle we'll set the minimum X size on the X axis to 20. Now for ease of reference, I'll rename these margins. With all this set up, we can start adding items or elements to our main elements and create the actual user interface of the inventory. Let's first have a look what we need to add. we have a vertical box with different buttons, an icon and a counter. We have a scroll container from which we can scroll vertically and inspect our inventory slots. And we have a vertical box which consists of both our item inspectors and a compare button and a delete button. To add these, we are first going to add our VBox container for our different buttons. These are tabs within our inventory. Also, we can add our scroll container, and scroll container immediately gives a warning as it only functions with either a HBox or a VBox container. So let's add those two. And all the way in the end we have another VBox container. So I can duplicate this one with D, drag it down here, and call it item inspector. With all that done, we can start setting the space that each of these three elements can take within our user interface. For our tabs, I don't want them to be too big, but also not too small. So I'm going to set a set size of 180 pixels. For the item inspector, it's the same story. We don't want it to be too big, but we also don't want it to become too small when it needs to be responsive, that stats are not displayed properly anymore. So we're going to add a set size of 300. Now for our scroll container, which will contain all our inventory items, we can have a little bit of a margin there to create the responsiveness that we need in the horizontal axis. So I'm not going to set a set size to the scroll container. I'm only going to say that it can take as much space as it wants to on the horizontal axis. Thereby we can see at the crosshair here a tapped button taking this much space, a scroll container in the middle taking a responsive amount of space, and an item inspector at the end with a set amount of 300 pixels. Now let's add our first button to the tabs. I'm going to add a child. It's going to be a texture rectangle, and I'm going to rename this to weapons. To that, I'll add another child, which will be a texture button, which I will give the same name. And to that button, I want to add another child, in this case a label, so we can label our button. Now I want this button to have a set size of 180 by 70. I'm going to add a background to this panel, and this will create the contrast so that you can recognize the button as clickable. With that said, you can also include this within the texture when you create your own custom buttons, but this is a quick tutorial, although on advanced features, that I'm simply using a few simple art elements for. For the weapons tab, I'm going to set it to full rectangle layout of its parent, and again with expand on, I'll add a paper background to the normal texture. Then with that set, I'm going to give it a little bit of margin from its parent to reveal the edge of the wooden background in the back. With the label, again I'll set it to full rectangle, and I'll give it the name that we want to show. As you can see, it immediately takes the standard the standard font of Godot, which we do not want. So I'm going to load up my fonts, and all these fonts are the same font as you have seen me set up earlier, but then with different sizes. So this is a 24 font size setup. I'm going to set the aligns to center, so our button name is centered, and I'll add a custom color and have a dark gray as the color. Right now it's not a functional button yet. We'll do that in the next episodes, but for now let's copy this tab or this button 5 times and rename all of them. Now I've renamed all our nodes for all the tabs, so all these are now consumables and weapons, armor, crafting consumables, others, and I've also included those names within all the labels within each button. Now we can add our gold icon, which will be a texture rectangle, and we can add our gold counter, which will be in a label. We rename this for easy reference in the future. And with expand on, we set the rectangle size. We need a rectangle size of about 180 by 90 for this particular texture. And for the gold counter, we again will use a custom font. In this case, we're going to use 30, I believe. And let's just test an amount here. We have to set the color too. Again, for this tutorial, I'm going to be using the same gray on every item or any text that we need to set. Please change us to your desire as you see fit. With that done, we have our first section of our inventory. Now let's head on to the next section, which will be our actual inventory items. This is probably going to be the most complex part of this tutorial. If you have any questions about it, please leave your comments down below. You can also find me on Twitch. I'm streaming every Tuesday and Thursday in the evening, European time. The times for both Pacific time and Eastern time will be down in the description below. For our scroll container, which I've not renamed yet with a purpose, we already have installed our VBox container, and within that VBox container we are going to add the horizontal containers, the HBox containers, for all our inventory items. Now we have to make sure that these containers take the amount of space that they're allowed to take. So we want this vertical box container to expand as much as possible, and also want them to expand as much as possible vertically. For our HBox containers, they already take the amount of space they can horizontally, but we need to set a set size for these HBox containers. Now I want their size to be 70. I think that's a size that works very, very well for the aesthetic, for the visual effect. Now, as for our name, I'm going to give this the name 101, and I'll explain why I do that later. But it's going to be very important for our future functionality when we're going to add code. Within one container, we of course want to have the icon of our item that we have in our inventory. For that, we're first going to add a texture rectangle for the background, and within the texture rectangle we will add a texture button. Now our texture rectangle, we can name this the item background, and we can rename this to the actual item button. The item background with expand on, I'm going to resize this to 70 by 70 square, and I'll add my double edge. So this is going to be an empty inventory slot to which we will be able to add an item button. The item button is going to be a layout full rectangle. In the future, once we loot something, or once we are gifted something, when something comes within our inventory, we will add an icon to this item button, and that way it will pop up in our inventory. Of course, we want to be able to keep the double-edged background for aesthetic reasons, so we need to give this item button a small amount of margin. In my case, I'm going to add -4, but depending on your window size and the textures that you use, it could be a little bit different. You have to fiddle around a little bit with that. Now, as a final touch, I will add a label to our texture button, and that label is going to be a fixed rectangle of 65 by 35, and I'll immediately add the font to this label, and I want it to be size 24. It can stay white, that's no problem. For our layout, I'm going to put it in the bottom right, and I want to make sure that it aligns the way I want it to align, and it does so perfectly. What we're going to do with this label, it will have no function within the weapon and the armor tab, as I don't want my weapons and armor to be stackable. But for every other stackable items, for example within our crafting, iron bars, iron ignites, iron ore, whatever, or the consumable, health potions, mana potions, you name it, you want stackable items to have a number show up within the icon, so you know how much you actually have. That is where this label will come into play in the future. With that done, we only have to add one more element for our first inventory slot to be finished. Within our horizontal container, we want to add one more child, which will be a label, and this is going to carry our item name, so our item name pops up in our inventory. Now the item name is going to be able to take as much space as it wants, both vertically and horizontally. And of course we want there to be a nice font. In this case I'm going with a size 30. Let's just test that out. I see we still need to change the color, so we're going to use a font color. Again, I'll use the same gray, and for our alignment we wanted to align in the center. Oh, not that center, we want to align there in the center. So now our whole inventory slot, one single slot, is finished. Now to add these functionality to all the slots, all the different inventory tabs, and to all the slots that we have, we're going to be using a lot of copy pasting. And when you do this copy pasting in the right order, you can actually make this quite easy for yourself. First, I'm going to delete the word sword, as we don't want to have sword everywhere within our inventory slots. I'm going to rename our scroll container to weapons. This is going to be the weapons tab. Where's the armor tab, you might ask? Well, we copy it in here. So this is going to be our armor tab. And we're also going to copy in the crafting tab. We're going to copy in a consumables tab. And we copy in, copy paste, another other tab. Now I have 5 scroll containers, each for the different elements. All 5 of them are showing at the moment, but we didn't see that in our example. What we're going to do is we're going to hide all these other tabs until one tab is only visible. We're going to code in future episodes how you can code it. When you click one of these buttons, it will unhide that particular tab, and it will hide the tab that is currently open, thereby opening a different inventory screen. As for how we can make sure that we can reference the right boxes for putting the right items in the right inventory, that's where this naming system comes in. So for all our weapon slots, they'll start within the 100 series, or our armor slots will be in the 200 series, and so forth for our crafting, our consumables, and our other. With that all renamed, we can now duplicate these items, and thereby automatically Godot's naming convention will make these 101 to 110, and we can add all those items, all those inventory slots for the different scroll containers containing our different inventory sections. Now make sure that you first copy paste the scroll containers before you're copy pasting the item elements, else you have to be renaming 10 elements within every scroll container, and if you first copy the scroll containers you only have to rename 1. With this all done, we have finished our second section of our inventory panel, and we can move on to section number 3, the item inspector. Before we start, let's have another look at the example to see what we need to make. We have 2 item inspectors which are almost identical, and we have the bottom section which has a delete button and a compare button to activate the second inspector. To create this, let's first set our main elements. For the item inspector, we're first going to add a vertical box container for our item inspector number 1. I won't be adding the item inspector number 2 yet, as they're almost identical copies to each other, so I'll be copy pasting that later. Now, the next we want to add a horizontal box container for our buttons below, and we want to have a little bit of margin between the two of them just for the aesthetics. So for that we'll add another label, which I happily misuse for our margin, and let's add another 20 pixels of margin to that label. Let's start by adding our buttons. For our trash bin, we're going to have a texture button. The size I'm putting at 100 by 100 pixels, and with expand on, I will drag the icon to the normal texture. As you can see, the texture is currently all the way on the top. We'll push that down to the bottom later on. Now for our second button, our compare button, this is almost an exact copy of one of these tabs. So I'm simply going to copy that and drag it down below next to our trash bin. Let's rename it to our compare. Let's rename the actual button itself to compare, and let's rename the label as well. Now, as you can currently see, our compare button takes as much space as it can vertically, and for aesthetic reasons we want all the buttons to pretty much look the same. Therefore, on the size flags I'm gonna deselect fill and I'm gonna set it to shrink to center. That way it will retain its original size and it will center with the trash bin. To make sure that these buttons are all the way on the bottom, let's go to item inspector. Let's go to the size flags and say that it can use as much space as it wants to vertically, thereby pushing our buttons all the way down. Now, as you can see right now, we're having an issue with our margin all the way down here. The reason is that it has been pushed beyond the screen. We can fix that by going to the vertical box of which it is part. As you can see, it is no longer part of the original layout or the original size layout of the paper background. We can simply reset that by going full rectangle again, pushing everything up. And as we have set everything in relationship to its parent and not with actual anchors on actual positions of the screen or on your menu, you can very easily make these sort of adjustments and everything will move along with it. Let's finish this part up by renaming our button to trash bin for future reference, and we can start with the item inspector. Under the item inspector, we're going to add a label. And in that label, in the future, when you select an item, it will show the actual item name. For now, let's go with a dummy text of item inspector so we can see if we have set up our text correctly. For that, we're going to center the alignment vertically. We're going to change the font size, the font color to 40. And of course, we have to add a custom font. In this case, we're going to add 30. Now let's add the rest of the functionality to the item inspector. For that, we add a HBox container, and within that HBox container, we want both the stats and the item icon. Now for the stats, I'm going to add a scroll container, because right now maybe our weapons or the IDs are, we have like 2, 3 or 4 stats on our weapons or our armor, but in the future we might add with expansion legendary equipment with many prefixes and suffixes with many magical properties. In that case, when we have 2 item inspectors underneath each other to inspect both items and compare them, we probably run out of space to display enough statistics within the space given within the menu. So by adding a scroll box container, we can prepare our game for future expansion or for many magical items within the game. So our HBox container will be allowed to take as much space vertically as possible, and we're going to add a scroll container, which will immediately ask for either a HBox or VBox container. It's going to be a VBox container again in our case, and to that HBox container we will add a item icon, and we'll be doing that with a texture rectangle. Let's rename all these items. So this is going to be the item icon, and within the VBox container we will have our stats. Now for the scroll container, also the scroll container can take horizontally and vertically as much space as it wants to, and the stats, these are going to be a fixed size. Maximum size vertically and horizontally. Within this vertical box container, within the scroll container, just as we did with the inventory elements, we're going to add horizontal box containers, which will have all our labels to display the information we want to display. So a single HBox container will consist of 2 labels, and these labels will be the stat name and the stat value. Now for both of these I'm going to add a custom font. In this case I'm going to add 24. Could have done this easier if I would have done this first and copied them afterwards, but for the sake of demonstration, we'll add them all like this. Let's add a test name and a test value. As you can see, we currently are not getting exactly as we wanted because they don't take up the space as we would want. We want 2 nice columns underneath each other. In order to do that, we're first going to set up a set size for the item icon. In this case we'll use a 70 by 70 icon. So when we add an icon in the future with expand on through the code, it will have a size of 70 by 70, and we want the stat name and the stat value to take up the space that is available, equally divided among the 2 of them. To do that, we're going to set both of these labels to expand horizontally as much as they can, and by setting this up for both at the same time, they'll share the space available, creating 2 equally sized labels, and thereby creating 2 nice columns arranged as we like it. Now for this HBox container, we can rename this to the actual stat that is within the stat name and the stat value, and we can start copy pasting this and renaming them as we see fit, and thereby of course having to change the labels. Now off screen I'm going to add a few statistics so we can add copy paste the second item inspector in there, and after that we'll round up this tutorial and the visuals of the user interface will be done, and we'll talk a little bit about future episodes, what you can expect and what functionality we're going to add to this inventory. Here we are. I have added attack, defense, agility, intelligence, wisdom, HP, armor penetration, stun and bleed as statistics for the different items that we could have. And now we're going to add the second item inspector by copy pasting in the second inspector. We can immediately start by seeing that the scroll container works. It puts everything in order, and both of the item inspectors take an equal amount of space. Now what I don't like is that they're so close towards each other, so just for aesthetics reasons I'm going to add 1 more label for our margin between these 2 inspectors, and I'll add a small amount of margin, maybe even less than the other ones. This time a margin of 14, thereby separating the inspectors as I see or as I desire. Now, with all of this done, we have created the user interface that we will be using in the next and upcoming episodes of this tutorial series to add our inventory items. Now, what you can expect for future episodes is that we want to create a loot chest, and which also includes the user interface for a loot panel. That will also include a item generation system to add loot to that specific loot chest, and then how we can use buttons like loot all and loot a single item to make sure everything goes to our inventory item in the right slots based on all those number identifications, the 101 to 1010 and the 201 to the 210, to make sure that everything is properly managed. We also, of course, want to add functionality to the window itself, adding functionality for pressing different tabs to open different inventory parts. And of course, we want to be able to select items within the item inspector, to compare items, to delete items. We want to be able to loot gold, and we want to be able to loot bosses or mobs, although those functionalities will be very similar to the functionalities of a loot chest. We also want to make sure that we have something like item tables and loot tables. So for that, we'll also be including JSON import within Godot. And of course, once we close the game, we want to be able to save the game. So we're going to add a item saver that saves our inventory to JSON, and how you can load that JSON file again on game startup. All these are sort of functionalities which surround the inventory system will all be included within this series. If you're excited to continue this project together with me, then please like and subscribe to make sure you don't miss any videos. Press that bell icon too. And again, if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below, or find me on Twitch. I stream every Tuesday, every Thursday, European time in the evening, and I'll include the times for both Pacific time and Eastern time down in the description below. Come hang out and ask me any questions regarding Godot or game design in general during the stream, and I'll be happy to see you there. Until the next video, see ya.